The wind cut through the Nevada wilderness like a blade, carrying with it the promise of another merciless winter night. Evelyn Greer stood at the edge of her husband's grave, her breath forming ghostly clouds in the bitter air as she stared at the weathered wooden cross that bore Samuel's name. The cemetery lay just beyond Silver Falls, a town that had grown around her like scar tissue, always present, but never quite healing right. 3 years. 3 years since she'd found Samuel's body hanging in their barn, 3 years since the town had whispered its theories and cast its judgments. 3 years since she'd become the outcast healer who lived on the edge of civilization, trusted with broken bones and fevered children, but never invited to Sunday services or town gatherings. She pulled her wool coat tighter and turned away from the grave, her medical bag heavy in her hand. Tonight, like every night, she would return to her cabin and tend to her herbs, grind her powders, and prepare her tinctures. Not because she believed in redemption anymore, but because healing others was the only way she could quiet the voice in her head that whispered she should have saved Samuel first. The frozen Carson River stretched before her as she took the shortcut home, its surface gleaming like polished steel under the pale moon. Evelyn had crossed this river 1,000 times, knew every rock and bend. But tonight, something was different. A sound drifted across the ice, low and rhythmic, like breathing, but deeper, more desperate. She stopped tilting her head. There it was again, a moan, barely human, coming from beneath the ice near the eastern bank. Her heart hammered as she approached, dropping to her knees and pressing her ear to the frozen surface. The sound was definitely coming from below, accompanied by what sounded like weak scratching. Jesus, she whispered, recognizing the signs. Someone had fallen through the ice and was trapped underneath, slowly drowning in the black water beneath. Without hesitation, Evelyn began clawing at the ice with her bare hands, her fingers immediately going numb from the cold. The ice was thick, nearly 4 inches, but desperation gave her strength she didn't know she possessed. Blood streaked the white surface as her fingernails tore and her knuckles split open. But she kept digging, chipping, breaking through bit by bit. The moaning grew weaker. Time was running out. Finally, mercifully, her fist broke through. Dark water rushed up through the hole, and immediately a hand thrust through brown skin adorned with a silver bracelet that caught the moonlight. Evelyn grabbed the hand and pulled with everything she had, widening the hole with her other hand until she could see a man's face, blue-lipped and barely conscious, his black hair floating around his head like seaweed. She hauled him from the water, his body limp and shuddering with cold. He was young, maybe 30, with the high cheekbones and copper skin of the Shoshone. Beaded leather clothing clung to his frame, and a medicine pouch hung around his neck, ceremonial items that marked him as someone important to his people. "Stay with me," she commanded, though his eyes had rolled back and his breathing was shallow. She stripped off her coat and wrapped it around him, then hoisted his arm over her shoulder. He was heavier than she'd expected, all muscle and bone, but she managed to half-carry, half-drag him toward her cabin. The blizzard struck just as she reached her door, as if the mountain spirits had been waiting for her to find safety before unleashing their fury. Snow began falling in thick sheets, and the wind howled like a living thing bent on destruction. Evelyn's cabin sat at the western edge of Silver Falls, close enough to town that people could find her when they needed healing, far enough away that she could live without constant judgment. She'd built it herself after Samuel's death, when staying in their old house had become unbearable. It was small but functional, a main room with a stone fireplace, a bedroom barely large enough for a bed, and a root cellar where she stored her medical supplies and preserved foods. The walls were lined with shelves holding jars of herbs she'd gathered from the surrounding mountains, sage for cleansing wounds, willow bark for pain, echinacea for infection. She'd learned herbalism from her mother, but had expanded her knowledge through trial and necessity. In a place where the nearest real doctor was 3 days' ride away, Evelyn Greer had become Silver Falls's unofficial physician. She stripped the Shoshone man of his wet clothes and wrapped him in every blanket she owned, then set to work building up the fire. His skin was cold as marble, his pulse barely detectable. She'd seen enough cases of near drowning to know he was still in mortal danger. Working by firelight, she prepared a warming draft ginger and cayenne to stimulate circulation honey, to provide energy, and a dash of whiskey to help his body generate heat. She forced the mixture between his blue lips, massaging his throat to make him swallow. As she worked, she noticed details that puzzled her. His clothes were travel-worn but well-made, suggesting he'd come from far away. The beadwork on his shirt was intricate, featuring patterns she'd never seen before. Not the geometric designs common to local tribes, but flowing organic shapes that seemed to tell a story. Most puzzling was a small leather pouch tied to his belt sealed with wax and bearing what looked like official markings. The storm raged for 3 days. During that time, the man drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes muttering words in a language Evelyn didn't recognize, sometimes staring at her with dark eyes that seemed to hold secrets. She tended him with the same methodical care she gave all her patients, checking his temperature, forcing fluids into him, watching for signs of lung infection. On the 4th morning, she woke to find him sitting up in bed fully alert and watching her with an intensity that made her reach for the knife she kept beside her sleeping mat. "You saved my life," he said in English, though his accent carried the musical inflections of his native tongue. Anyone would have done the same. Evelyn replied, though they both knew that wasn't true. Not for a Shoshone man, not in Silver Falls. "I am Toa," he said. "I was traveling east when my horse spooked and threw me through the ice. I thought I would die there in the dark water. What brought you so far from your people?" His expression shuddered. "That is not your concern, but I owe you a debt that can never be repaid." "I don't want repayment. I just want to know if there are people looking for you, people who might come here." Something flickered in his eyes, fear maybe, or anger. "There are always people looking for men like me, but I will be gone before they arrive. You're not going anywhere for at least a week. You nearly died from exposure and your lung function is still compromised. One day of hard travel could kill you." He started to protest, but a coughing fit proved her point. Blood flecked his lips, and she was immediately beside him, checking his pulse and listening to his breathing. "Pulmonary edema," she murmured. "Your lungs are still clearing water. You need rest, proper food, and time." "Time is something I don't have," Toe said grimly. "But it seems I have no choice but to trust you." That afternoon, while Toe slept, Evelyn made her first mistake. She walked into town to buy supplies, thinking no one would question a routine trip to Morrison's general store. She needed food for 2 people and more medicinal herbs than her diminished winter stores could provide. Morrison's store occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on Silver Falls's main street, its windows fogged with condensation from the pot-bellied stove that kept the interior warm. James Morrison was a bear of a man, with graying hair and calloused hands, who'd been running the store for 15 years. He was one of the few people in town who treated Evelyn with something approaching respect, largely because his wife Sarah was one of her regular patients. "Afternoon, Evelyn," Morrison called out as she entered, his voice carrying the rough edges of someone who'd spent years shouting over mining equipment. "Sarah's been asking after you. Her joints have been acting up again with this cold snap. I'll prepare her a fresh batch of willow bark tea," Evelyn replied, gathering supplies from the shelves. "And maybe some of that liniment I made last fall." Morrison nodded, then frowned as he watched her pile an unusual amount of food onto the counter. Expecting company, that's enough grub for a week. Evelyn's hands stilled. She'd been so focused on Toe's medical needs that she hadn't considered how her purchases might look. Just stocking up before the next storm, she said, forcing her voice to remain casual. But Morrison wasn't fooled. His eyes, shrewd from years of reading customers and calculating profit margins, studied her face. You sure about that? Because word is some army boys came through yesterday asking questions about missing property. Evelyn's blood turned to ice. What kind of property? The kind that walks on two legs and causes trouble for decent folks. Morrison said, his voice dropping low. Now, I'm not saying I believe everything the Army tells us, but if you know something about an escaped Indian, it might be wise to share that information. I don't know what you're talking about, Evelyn said, but her hands were trembling as she counted out coins for her purchases. Morrison leaned across the counter, his expression earnest. Look, Evelyn, I know you've had your troubles, and I know you've got a good heart. But harboring a fugitive Indian, that's the kind of thing that could get you hanged regardless of your intentions. I appreciate the concern, James, but I assure you it's misplaced. She left the store with her supplies, but the damage was done. Morrison was many things, but he wasn't stupid. And if army men were already asking questions, she hurried home through streets that suddenly seemed full of watching eyes, every shadow potentially hiding someone who meant her harm. By the time she reached her cabin, her heart was pounding, and her mind was racing with possibilities, none of them good. They're looking for you, she announced as she burst through her front door. Toei was sitting by the fire, fully dressed in clothes she'd found for him, a spare shirt of Samuel's and pants that were too long but serviceable. He'd been examining the contents of his medicine pouch, but he quickly tucked everything away at her entrance. How many? He asked calmly. I don't know. Morrison said army men came through yesterday asking about missing property. They described you as an escaped Indian. Escaped from what? She demanded. What aren't you telling me? Toa was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. My people lived in the Oihi Mountains for generations. We had treaties agreements with the government. But treaties are just paper when there's silver in the ground. He pulled out the sealed pouch she'd noticed earlier, holding it like it contained something precious. This contains proof of our legal claim to the land. Maps, treaty documents, witness statements. Everything needed to prove that the mining claims in our territory are illegal. Then why are you running? Why not take it to the territorial government? Because the territorial government is owned by the same men who want our land. Because my brother tried to do exactly that and was found dead 3 days later, his body dumped in a ravine like garbage. The bitterness in his voice made Evelyn's chest tighten. She'd seen enough of frontier justice to know he was probably right. So, where were you taking it? Washington? There are men in the federal government who might listen, who might care more about law than profit. But first, I have to get there alive. Before Evelyn could respond, the sound of approaching horses cut through the afternoon air. Multiple riders moving fast. She peered through the window and saw 3 men in blue uniforms riding hard toward her cabin. Hide, she hissed, but Toe was already moving, disappearing into her bedroom with fluid grace. The riders pulled up outside with a spray of snow and gravel. Their leader was a man in his 40s with sergeant stripes on his sleeve and the kind of weathered face that came from years of frontier service. His companions were younger, but they carried themselves with the easy confidence of men accustomed to violence. Afternoon, ma'am. The sergeant called out, his voice carrying false courtesy. I'm Sergeant Briggs, United States Army. Mind if we have a word? Evelyn stepped onto her porch, closing the door firmly behind her. "What can I do for you, Sergeant?" "We're looking for a fugitive Indian believed to be in this area. Male about 30 years old, traveling alone. You seen anyone matching that description?" "No one's dangerous here but the men who think they own the land," she replied evenly. Briggs's eyes sharpened. "That's an interesting way to put it. Mind if we take a look around, just to be thorough?" "Yes, I do mind. This is private property and you have no warrant." "We don't need a warrant to pursue a fugitive, ma'am. And harboring a criminal is a federal offense." One of the younger soldiers started to dismount, but Evelyn moved to block his path. "I said no. If you want to search my property, you'll need proper authorization from the territorial marshal." The soldier looked to Briggs, who shook his head slightly. "We'll be back, ma'am. And when we are, we'll have all the authorization we need." They rode away, but Evelyn knew it wasn't over. She had maybe a few hours before they returned with more men and fewer scruples about following legal procedures. "They'll be back tonight," she said as Toe emerged from hiding. "Probably with enough men to search every building in town. Then I need to leave now. You can barely walk to the privy without getting winded. A hard ride will kill you faster than a bullet. Better to die free than captured. Or better to live and fight another day." Evelyn was already moving, gathering supplies from her medical stores. "There's an old mining shaft about 2 miles north of here in the foothills. It's been abandoned for years, but it's defensible. We can hole up there until you're strong enough to travel." She paused in her packing, surprised by her own words. "I can't let them take you. Whatever you've done, whatever you're carrying, it's important enough that they're willing to kill for it. That makes it important enough for me to help." "You don't know what I've lost," Toa said quietly. "No, but I know what you chose to save," she replied, thinking of the documents in his pouch. "And I know what it means to lose everything and keep fighting anyway." They gathered what they could carry: food, medical supplies, warm clothes, and her father's old hunting rifle, and slipped out the back of the cabin as the sun began to set. The mining shaft was a relic from Silver Falls's early days, when prospectors had dug holes all over the mountainside looking for easy silver. Most had been abandoned when the real deposits were found deeper in the earth, but they provided excellent hiding places for those who knew where to look. The shaft they chose was partially collapsed, making it invisible from a distance, but still providing shelter. They settled in for what promised to be a long, cold night, taking turns keeping watch and listening for the sound of pursuing horses. They returned to find her cabin ransacked. Furniture overturned, shelves emptied, even the floorboards pried up in places. Briggs and his men had been thorough in their search and creative in their destruction. They were looking for more than just a hiding place. Evelyn observed, surveying the damage. This was meant to send a message. Toa knelt beside the fireplace where someone had scattered her herb jars and ground their contents into the floor. "In my experience, men who destroy medicine are men who destroy hope. They want your people to know that helping me comes with a price." "Then we make sure it was worth the price," Evelyn said grimly. Over the next few days, they fell into an uneasy partnership. Evelyn continued to treat patients who sought her out, though fewer came now that word of the Army's interest had spread. Toa slowly regained his strength, and in exchange for her care, he began teaching her things about frontier survival that her medical training had never covered. He showed her how to identify edible plants, even in winter, how to move through snow without leaving obvious tracks, how to build a fire that gave warmth without betraying smoke. In return, she taught him about the chemistry behind her medicines, how certain plant compounds could be concentrated or combined for greater effect. "Your people have much knowledge. he said one evening as she demonstrated how to extract salicin from willow bark using a process of boiling and reduction. But you've forgotten how to listen to the plants themselves. He pulled out a small pouch from his medicine bag and showed her its contents, dried roots and leaves she didn't recognize. This is bitterroot. Your books would tell you it's just food, but prepared correctly, it can heal wounds that refuse to close. The knowledge isn't in the plant itself, but in the relationship between the healer and what is healed. Sounds like superstition to me, Evelyn said, but she was intrigued despite herself. Is it superstition when it works, your husband's death? Did your medical knowledge save him? The question hit like a physical blow. That's different. He didn't want to be saved. Didn't he? Or did he need something you couldn't give him with all your medicines and knowledge? Before she could respond, a knock at the door interrupted them. Evelyn grabbed her rifle while Toe disappeared into the bedroom, but the voice that called out was familiar. Evelyn, it's Martha Henley. I need help. Martha was one of Silver Falls's more prominent citizens, married to the bank president and mother of 3 children. She was also one of the few townspeople who'd never actively shunned Evelyn, though their relationship was cordial rather than friendly. Evelyn opened the door to find Martha standing in the snow, her face pale with worry. It's my youngest, Tommy. He's burning up with fever, and Dr. Patterson is snowed in at the Widow Creek settlement. Please, I know you're not a real doctor, but... Bring him here, Evelyn said without hesitation. How long has he been sick? 3 days. It started as a cough, but now he's delirious and won't keep food down. Martha returned within the hour, carrying a small bundle that turned out to be a boy of maybe 7 years old. His skin was flushed with fever, his breathing rapid and shallow. Evelyn examined him quickly, noting the rash on his chest and the distinctive sound of his cough. Scarlet fever, she diagnosed. It's serious, but treatable if we act quickly. She set to work preparing a treatment regimen willow bark tea to reduce the fever, honey and lemon to soothe the throat, and a steam treatment with eucalyptus oil to help clear his breathing. As she worked, she was acutely aware of Toe, hidden in the next room, and Martha's anxious presence. I heard there was some trouble here recently, Martha said as Evelyn coaxed medicine into Tommy's mouth. Something about the army looking for an escaped Indian. People talk too much in small towns, Evelyn replied carefully. They do indeed, but sometimes they're right to talk. I've lived here long enough to know when something dangerous is stirring. Martha's tone was odd, almost probing. Evelyn looked up from her patient to study the woman's face more carefully. What are you trying to say, Martha? I'm saying that people are scared. Scared enough to do things they might not normally do. Report things they might not normally report. The warning was clear, but was it a threat or a kindness Evelyn couldn't tell? And that uncertainty made her skin crawl. Tommy's fever broke the next morning, and Martha left with profound gratitude and a promise to spread word of Evelyn's skill. But as Evelyn watched her go, she couldn't shake the feeling that Martha's visit had been about more than just her son's illness. She knows, Toa said simply when she voiced her concerns. Maybe. Or maybe she's just being cautious. In my experience, when white settlers start talking about being scared, it usually means someone's about to die. That afternoon brought visitors that confirmed Toe's pessimism. Morrison arrived with 2 other men Evelyn recognized as prominent townspeople, Mayor Garrett and Sheriff Collins. Their expressions were grim, and Collins wore his gun prominently displayed. Afternoon, Evelyn. Morrison said, his usual warmth replaced by formal distance. We need to have a conversation. About what? About your responsibility to this community, Mayor Garrett interjected. He was a thin man with pale eyes, and the kind of mustache that required daily grooming. We've received reports that you might be harboring a fugitive. Reports from whom? Sheriff Collins stepped forward. He was younger than the others, eager to prove himself in a job that rarely required actual law enforcement. That doesn't matter. What matters is that harboring a fugitive puts the entire town at risk. The Army's already made it clear they consider this a military matter. And what exactly are you asking me to do? If you're harboring this Indian, turn him over, Garrett said bluntly. If you're not, allow us to search your property so we can assure the Army that Silver Falls is cooperating fully with their investigation. Evelyn felt anger building in her chest, the same fury that had sustained her through 3 years of whispered accusations and social isolation. And if I refuse, then we'll have to consider whether your medical services are worth the risk you pose to community safety, Collins said. A woman living alone, dealing with dangerous elements, it makes people nervous. The threat was clear enough. Cooperate or be driven out of the only life she had left. Give me until tomorrow to consider your request, she said finally. Evelyn. Morrison said, his voice gentler than the others. I've known you for years. Whatever you're thinking, whatever you're planning, it's not worth dying for. After they left, Evelyn sat in her kitchen and stared at her hands. They were steady, which surprised her. She'd expected fear, but instead she felt something that might have been relief. The choice was no longer hers to make. The river tried to claim you, but I pulled you back, she said to Toa when she told him about the visit. Maybe it was both our second chances. That night, Martha Henley returned. But this time she wasn't alone. Evelyn heard the horses long before she saw them, too many horses for a medical call. She woke Toe and grabbed her rifle, but when she peered through the window, she saw Martha dismounting alongside Sergeant Briggs and 4 soldiers. She sold us out, Toei said grimly. We don't know that. Mrs. Greer, Briggs called out. We know you're harboring a fugitive. Come out peacefully and no one gets hurt. Evelyn looked at Toe, who had gone very still beside her. In the moonlight filtering through her window, his face looked carved from stone. There's another way out, she whispered. Through the root cellar. You can... No more running, he said simply. If I die here, at least, I die protecting someone who chose to help me. You're not dying here. Not if I can help it. Evelyn moved to her medicine cabinet and pulled out a small vial of clear liquid, chloroform distilled from components she'd ordered from Denver for surgical procedures. She'd never used it as a weapon before, but desperate times called for creative solutions. What are you doing? Buying us time. She soaked a cloth with the chloroform and stuffed it into a jar along with some of her mother's old smoke powder, a mixture of saltpeter, sulfur, and charcoal that created thick, choking clouds when ignited. When I light this, it'll fill the room with smoke and gas. Hold your breath and count to 30, then head for the root cellar. What about you? I'll be right behind you. Before he could protest, she opened the front door. Sergeant Briggs, she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. I want to discuss terms. The only terms are surrender, ma'am. Send the Indian out with his hands visible. I need guarantees about his treatment, and I need to know why he's so important to you. Briggs dismounted and walked closer, his hand resting on his pistol. That's not your concern, ma'am. Your concern is avoiding a charge of treason. Treason for helping a wounded man. For harboring a spy and a murderer. That Indian killed 3 soldiers and stole classified documents. He's not the noble savage you think he is. Martha stepped forward, her face pale in the moonlight. Evelyn, please. I brought them here to help you. If you cooperate, they'll be lenient. Help me, By destroying my home and threatening my life. By keeping you from making a mistake that will get you hanged, Martha insisted. I saw the Indian when I came for Tommy. I saw him hiding in your bedroom. I had to make a choice, report it. Maybe save your life or stay silent and watch you throw your life away for a stranger. The betrayal cut deep, but Evelyn couldn't entirely blame Martha. In her position with children to protect, she might have made the same choice. I understand your position, Martha. But I can't abandon someone who needs help. It's not who I am. Then you're a fool, Briggs snapped. And foolish women get themselves killed. Men prepare to breach. Evelyn backed toward her door, her hand finding the prepared smoke bomb. Wait, I'll bring him out. Just give me a moment to convince him. 1 minute, Briggs agreed. Then we're coming in. She slammed the door and immediately lit the fuse. The smoke bomb went off with a soft whoosh, filling the cabin with thick, acrid smoke laced with chloroform vapors. She held her breath and counted, then felt her way to the root cellar entrance. But Toe wasn't there. Through the smoke, she saw him standing by the front window, the sealed pouch in his hands. Go, he said, his voice muffled by the cloth he'd pressed over his nose and mouth. Take this to Washington. Tell them what happened here. I'm not leaving you. This isn't about me anymore. It's about justice for my people. Before she could argue, the door exploded inward. Soldiers poured into the smoke-filled room, coughing and cursing as the chloroform did its work. But there were too many of them, and the effects weren't strong enough to incapacitate trained men. Toa threw himself at the first soldier through the door, his hands finding the man's throat. They went down in a tangle of limbs, but another soldier was already raising his rifle. Evelyn moved without thinking, Samuel's old hunting rifle suddenly in her hands. The shot was deafening in the confined space, and the soldier stumbled backward, his shoulder blooming red. Son of a bitch! Briggs roared through the smoke. Take them both. What followed was chaos. More soldiers crashed through her windows, the smoke making visibility impossible. Evelyn fired twice more, not sure if she hit anyone, just trying to create enough confusion for Toe to escape. But escape was impossible. A rifle butt connected with her skull, dropping her to her knees. Through blurred vision, she saw Toa go down under 3 soldiers, his face bloody, but his eyes still defiant. Search them, Briggs ordered. Find those documents. But when they searched Toa, the pouch was gone. In the confusion of the fight, he'd managed to hide it somewhere. Where are they? Briggs demanded, pressing his boot against Toa's neck. Toa said nothing, just stared up at his captor with hatred burning in his dark eyes. Sergeant, one of the soldiers called out. We've got a problem. Through the broken windows, Evelyn could see lights moving in the distance. Lanterns, torches, the bobbing illumination of people moving through the night toward her cabin. Half the town's coming, the soldier reported. They heard the shots. Briggs cursed under his breath. Whatever he'd planned to do to extract information from Toe, he couldn't do it with witnesses. Load them up. We're taking them back to Fort Bragg for proper interrogation. As they dragged Evelyn and Toe outside, she saw familiar faces in the crowd of approaching townspeople. Morrison, his wife, Sarah Mayer Garrett, even some of her patients. Their expressions ranged from concern to suspicion to outright hostility. What's the meaning of this? Morrison demanded, his rough voice cutting through the night air. Military business, Briggs replied curtly. These 2 are under arrest for harboring fugitive enemy combatants and assaulting federal officers. Enemy combatants. Sarah Morrison stepped forward, her face flushed with indignation. That woman delivered 3 of my children and saved my life when I had pneumonia. She's no traitor." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd. Whatever Martha's motivations, not everyone in Silver Falls was willing to see Evelyn dragged away in chains. "That's not for you people to decide," Briggs snapped. "Clear the way or face charges of interfering with military operations." But as he spoke, one of his soldiers whispered urgently in his ear. Evelyn couldn't hear what was said, but she saw Briggs's expression change. "Sergeant," Morrison said, his voice taking on a harder edge, "I'm the duly elected representative of this town to the territorial legislature. I demand to know under what authority you're operating here." "Under the authority of Colonel Thompson, commanding officer of Fort Bragg." "Colonel Thompson has no jurisdiction in civilian matters. If these people committed crimes, they should be turned over to local authorities for trial." The crowd was growing larger and more restive. Evelyn realized that whatever else happened tonight, Briggs couldn't simply make her and Toe disappear. Too many people knew they'd been taken, and too many questions would be asked. "This conversation is over," Briggs declared. "Load the prisoners." As they tied Evelyn and Toe to horses, Martha approached. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I thought I was protecting you." "You were protecting yourself," Evelyn replied, but without heat. "I understand. Just take care of the people who need medicine. Promise me that." Martha nodded, tears streaming down her face. They rode through the night toward Fort Bragg, but Evelyn's mind was racing. The documents were still hidden somewhere in her cabin, and Morrison was asking the right questions. If she and Toe could survive whatever interrogation awaited them, there might still be hope for justice. She just had to survive long enough to see it. Fort Bragg squatted on the eastern edge of the territory. Like a cancerous growth, its wooden walls and squat buildings designed for function rather than beauty. Evelyn had never been inside its walls before, but she'd heard enough stories to know that few people entered as prisoners and left as anything more than cautionary tales. They were separated immediately upon arrival. Toei was dragged toward what looked like a punishment block, while Evelyn was shoved into a small room that might generously be called an office. A single window provided weak morning light, and the only furniture was a desk, 2 chairs, and a cabinet that probably held records. She waited for 2 hours before the door opened, and a man entered who clearly wasn't Sergeant Briggs. This man was older, grayer, with the kind of bearing that came from years of command. His uniform was immaculate, and he moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to having his orders followed without question. "Mrs. Greer, I presume," he said, taking the chair across from her. "I'm Colonel Thompson. I apologize for the circumstances of your arrival, but desperate times require decisive action." His voice was cultured, educated, not what she'd expected from a frontier military officer. "Where's Toe?" "Being questioned by my specialists. Indians require different interrogation techniques than civilized people." The casual cruelty in his tone made Evelyn's blood run cold. "If you hurt him, you're hardly in a position to make threats, my dear. But I'm hoping we can resolve this matter without unnecessary unpleasantness." Thompson opened a folder and spread several documents across the desk. Even upside down, Evelyn could see they were official-looking papers with government seals. "You're a healer," he continued. "A woman dedicated to preserving life. I respect that. But the man you've been helping is a terrorist who murdered 3 of my soldiers in cold blood." "I don't believe that." "Belief is irrelevant. Facts are what matter." He turned one of the documents toward her. "This is the official report of the incident. 3 soldiers found dead, their throats cut, valuable intelligence missing." The report looked authentic, complete with witness statements and military stamps. But something about it bothered Evelyn, though she couldn't put her finger on what. What intelligence? That's classified. What's not classified is that harboring him makes you an accomplice to murder, unless, of course, you're willing to cooperate in recovering what he stole. And if I cooperate, then this becomes a case of mistaken judgment rather than treason. You return to your cabin, resume your medical practice, and everyone forgets this unfortunate incident ever occurred. It was a tempting offer, especially given her current circumstances. But Evelyn had learned to read people during her years as a healer, and something in Thompson's manner suggested his offer wasn't as generous as it sounded. What happens to Toe? Justice takes its course. He murdered federal soldiers. He hangs for it. And if I don't cooperate? Thompson's facade of civility slipped slightly. Then you hang beside him. The choice is yours, Mrs. Greer. Before she could respond, the door burst open, and Sergeant Briggs entered, his face flushed with excitement. Colonel, we found them. The documents? In the woman's root cellar, hidden under loose floorboards. The Indian must have stashed them there during the fight. Thompson's expression grew thunderous as he examined what Briggs handed him. Evelyn couldn't see the contents clearly, but she could see that Thompson was reading with increasing agitation. Son of a bitch, he muttered. How did they get hold of these? Does it matter? Briggs asked. We have them now. It matters because if copies exist, if other people have seen these. Thompson trailed off his eyes, moving to Evelyn. What do you know about the contents of these documents? Nothing, she lied. Toa never showed them to me. I don't believe you. Believe what you want. It's the truth. Thompson studied her for a long moment and then nodded to Briggs. Take her to the detention barracks. I need time to think about how to handle this. As they dragged her away, Evelyn caught a glimpse of the documents Thompson was holding. She couldn't read much, but she saw enough to understand why he was so agitated. Maps, surveys, legal documents, all bearing official government seals and signatures. Whatever Toe had been carrying it was explosive enough to destroy careers and maybe change the balance of power in the territory. The detention barracks turned out to be a long, low building with small cells barely large enough to hold a cot and a bucket. Evelyn was shoved into one near the end of the hall, close enough to hear if anyone else was being held nearby. She didn't have to wait long. From somewhere down the hall came the sound of voices, one of them definitely Toe's, though he was speaking in his native language. The other voice belonged to someone she didn't recognize, but the tone was urgent, almost pleading. Hours passed. Guards came and went, but no one spoke to her. Food appeared, a bowl of thin soup and a crust of bread, but she had no appetite. Her mind kept turning over what she'd seen and heard, trying to piece together the larger picture. Thompson had been genuinely shocked by whatever was in those documents. Shocked enough to abandon his earlier offer of clemency. That suggested the papers contained something more damaging than simple treaty violations or land disputes. It was near midnight when she heard the sound she'd been dreading, boots in the hallway, multiple sets moving with purpose. They stopped outside her cell and keys rattled in the lock. Mrs. Greer, Briggs said as the door swung open. Colonel Thompson wants to see you. They escorted her back to the office, but this time Thompson wasn't alone. Two other men in civilian clothes flanked his desk, one young and nervous-looking, the other older with the kind of expensive suit that suggested political connections. Mrs. Greer, Thompson said without preamble, I'd like you to meet Thomas Whitfield from the Territorial Governor's Office, and James Crawford, who represents certain mining interests in the region. Crawford stepped forward, his pale eyes studying Evelyn like she was a specimen in a jar. "Mrs. Greer, we understand you've become entangled in a situation beyond your comprehension. We're here to offer you a way out." "What kind of way out?" "Complete exoneration," Whitfield said quickly. "All charges dropped, your reputation restored, even compensation for the damage to your property. In exchange for what?" "Your testimony that the Indian confessed to murdering 3 soldiers and that he forced you to help him at gunpoint," Crawford explained. "A simple statement that corroborates what we already know to be true." "But it's not true." "Truth is a flexible concept, Mrs. Greer. What matters is justice." "Whose justice?" Crawford's expression hardened. "The kind that ensures civilization prevails over savagery. The kind that protects innocent settlers from terrorist attacks. The kind that allows decent people to build lives and communities without fear." "And if I refuse?" "Then you'll be tried for treason alongside your Indian friend," Thompson said bluntly. "And I promise you, Mrs. Greer, frontier justice moves swiftly. We'll have you both hanged within the week." The threat hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Evelyn looked at the 3 men arrayed against her and realized she was seeing the true face of power in the territory, military, political, and economic interests aligned against anyone who threatened their control. "I need time to consider your offer," she said finally. "You have until tomorrow morning," Crawford said. "Choose wisely, Mrs. Greer. Some mistakes can't be undone." Back in her cell, Evelyn lay awake staring at the ceiling and thinking about choices. She could save herself by condemning Toei, but that would make her complicit in whatever injustice had brought him to her door. She could refuse and face execution, but that would accomplish nothing except adding her death to his. Or she could find a third option. The idea came to her near dawn, born of desperation, and the kind of desperate hope that sustained people through impossible odds. It was dangerous, probably suicidal, but it offered the slimmest chance of exposing the truth before they silenced her forever. She just had to survive long enough to put it into action. When Briggs came for her the next morning, Evelyn was ready. "I'll testify," she told Thompson, Crawford, and Whitfield when they assembled in the office. "But I have conditions." Crawford leaned back in his chair, a slight smile playing at his lips. "You're hardly in a position to make demands, Mrs. Greer. I want to speak with Toe before the trial, to tell him what I'm going to do." "Absolutely not," Thompson said immediately. "Then there's no deal." Evelyn crossed her arms. "You need my testimony to make this stick, especially with people from Silver Falls asking questions. But if I'm going to betray someone who trusted me, I'm going to look him in the eye when I do it." The 3 men exchanged glances. Finally, Crawford nodded. 5 minutes, under guard. 10 minutes, alone. "Mrs. Greer, he's chained, I'm unarmed, and you have a building full of soldiers. What are you afraid of?" After another round of silent communication, Thompson agreed. 10 minutes, but if you try anything, you'll kill us both, I understand." They led her through the fort to another building, this one clearly designed for holding dangerous prisoners. The cells were smaller and darker, with heavy iron bars and locks that looked like they could hold a grizzly bear. Toho was in the last cell, and the sight of him made Evelyn's heart clench. His face was bruised, one eye swollen shut, and blood crusted his split lip. But his remaining eye burned with undiminished defiance. 10 minutes, Briggs said, unlocking the cell door. "We'll be right outside." Evelyn waited until she heard their footsteps recede before speaking. "Are you all right?" "I've been better. You? They want me to testify against you. Say you confessed to murder." Toa's expression didn't change. "Will you?" What would you do if our positions were reversed? I'd tell the truth and accept the consequences, even if it meant your death. Especially then. Death is just another journey. Living with shame follows you into the next world. Evelyn moved closer to the bars, lowering her voice. The documents they found, what's really in them? Proof that Thompson and Crawford orchestrated the massacre of my village to clear the land for mining. Government surveys showing silver deposits, military orders to pacify hostile elements, payment records for hired guns. Jesus. My brother died getting those papers. He was working as a translator at the fort when he discovered what they were planning. He tried to warn our people, but they were already moving. The massacre happened 3 days later. How many? 87 people. Men, women, children, elders. All killed so Crawford's company could access a silver vein that runs under what used to be our sacred burial ground. The magnitude of it staggered her. Not just murder, but genocide driven by greed and justified by prejudice. They're going to destroy the documents after the trial, Evelyn said. Bury the evidence along with us. Probably, but at least you tried to help. That matters to me. It's not over yet. Before Toe could ask what she meant, the guards returned. Time's up. As they led her away, Evelyn caught Toe's eye one last time. Whatever happens next, remember that you saved me first. In the river. You gave me a reason to fight. The trial was scheduled for the next morning to be held in the fort's assembly hall before a hastily convened military tribunal. 3 officers would serve as judges, with Thompson acting as prosecutor. Toe would have no legal representation, and Evelyn's testimony would be the key evidence against him. That evening, as she sat in her cell preparing for what might be her last night alive, Evelyn heard unexpected sounds from outside voices, wagon wheels, the commotion of people arriving. She climbed onto her cot and peered through the small barred window. What she saw made her heart leap. A convoy of wagons and riders was pulling through the fort's gates, and she recognized several faces from Silver Falls. Morrison was there, along with his wife Sarah and at least a dozen other townspeople. They'd come to witness the trial. But that wasn't what made her pulse quicken. Among the crowd, she spotted a figure she hadn't expected to see, a tall, distinguished man in a black suit who carried himself with the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. She'd never seen him before, but his presence suggested that word of the trial had reached beyond the immediate area. Whatever happened tomorrow, it wouldn't happen in the darkness and isolation Thompson had planned. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Evelyn was awakened before sunrise and given time to wash and change into clean clothes, a grim courtesy that suggested the importance of appearances in what was to come. The assembly hall was packed when they brought her in. She saw Morrison and Sarah in the front row, their faces grim but supportive. The stranger in the black suit sat near the back, taking notes in a leather-bound journal. Other faces she recognized from Silver Falls were scattered throughout the crowd, along with soldiers, fort personnel, and people she didn't know. Toa was already seated at a table near the front, his hands and feet shackled. Despite his injuries, he sat straight and proud, meeting the hostile stares of the crowd with quiet dignity. The 3 judges entered, all colonels, all with the weathered faces of career military men. Thompson took his place at the prosecutor's table, flanked by Crawford and Whitfield. The proceedings had all the formal trappings of legitimate justice, but Evelyn could feel the corruption underneath like rot in a foundation. This tribunal is convened to determine the guilt or innocence of the defendant, known as Toa, a member of the Shoshone tribe, in the matter of the murders of Corporals James Wilson, David Mitchell, and Henry Barnes, all of the United States Army, the presiding judge announced. Thompson rose to present his case. He was eloquent and persuasive, painting a picture of Toa as a dangerous savage who had infiltrated the fort, murdered 3 soldiers in cold blood, and stolen classified documents. The evidence he claimed was overwhelming and supported by eyewitness testimony. The prosecution calls Mrs. Evelyn Greer to the witness stand. Evelyn stood and walked to the front of the hall, acutely aware of every eye upon her. She placed her hand on the Bible and swore to tell the truth, knowing that what she was about to do would either save them both or doom them both. Mrs. Greer, Thompson began, "Please tell this tribunal how you came to encounter the defendant." "I found him dying under the ice of the Carson River," she said clearly. "I pulled him out and brought him to my cabin to treat his injuries." "And during his time in your care, did he make any statements about his actions prior to his injury?" This was the moment. The crossroads where she would either betray everything she believed in or risk everything for the truth. "Yes," she said. "He told me he was fleeing from the scene of a massacre." Thompson smiled, but his expression faltered when she continued. "A massacre of his people. 87 men, women and children murdered by hired killers working for mining interests and covered up by corrupt military officers." The courtroom erupted in shocked murmurs. Thompson shot to his feet. "Objection. The witness is not answering the question asked." "I'm answering exactly the question you asked," Evelyn replied calmly. "You asked what he told me about his actions. He told me he was the sole survivor of a war crime, and that he was carrying evidence that would expose the perpetrators." "Mrs. Greer," the presiding judge warned, "you're under oath to tell the truth." "That is the truth, Your Honor, and I can prove it." She reached into her dress and pulled out a folded document, one she'd hidden days earlier during her first examination of Toa's belongings. While everyone had been focused on the sealed pouch, she'd quietly copied one of the most damning documents onto medical paper and secreted it away. "This is a copy of a military order dated 3 months ago, signed by Colonel Thompson and witnessed by Sergeant Briggs. It authorizes the pacification of hostile elements in the Owyhee Mountains and specifically mentions the need to clear indigenous squatters from valuable mineral deposits." Thompson lunged toward her, but Morrison and several other townspeople were already moving, forming a protective barrier around the witness stand. "That document is classified," Thompson shouted. "This woman has committed treason. The only treason here is the betrayal of innocent people for profit," Evelyn replied. She turned to address the crowd directly. "Toa didn't murder 3 soldiers. 3 soldiers were killed trying to stop the theft of documents that proved genocide. He's not a criminal, he's a witness to mass murder." The stranger in the black suit stood up, his voice cutting through the chaos. "I am Federal Marshal Robert Hayes, sent by the Department of Justice to investigate reports of irregularities in territorial governance. I hereby place Colonel Thompson, James Crawford, and Thomas Whitfield under federal arrest for conspiracy murder and violations of federal treaty obligations." What followed was pandemonium. Thompson drew his sidearm, but Morrison tackled him before he could use it. Crawford tried to flee but was stopped by several townspeople who had apparently heard enough. Whitfield simply collapsed into his chair, his face white with shock. In the confusion, Evelyn saw Toa watching her with something that might have been admiration. She'd gambled everything on the hope that federal investigators were already looking into territorial corruption and that her testimony would provide the evidence they needed. The gamble had paid off, but at a cost she was only beginning to understand. The investigation that followed lasted 3 months and revealed corruption that reached into the highest levels of territorial government. Crawford's mining company had bribed officials, forged documents, and orchestrated the systematic removal of Native American populations from mineral-rich lands. Thompson and his officers had been willing accomplices, providing military force to support what amounted to ethnic cleansing. Toa was not only exonerated, but officially recognized as a federal witness, whose courage had exposed massive criminal conspiracy. The real killers of the 3 soldiers were identified as Crawford's hired guns, who had murdered the men when they tried to prevent the theft of incriminating documents. But justice, Evelyn learned, was more complicated than she'd hoped. Thompson was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Crawford received 20 years for conspiracy and fraud. Whitfield, who had been more pawn than player, received 5 years and agreed to testify against other corrupt officials. Yet the Shoshone people remained displaced. The mining claims were invalidated, but the survivors of the massacre had scattered to other reservations. The land that held their sacred sites remained empty, a wound that would take generations to heal. Justice and healing are different things. Toei explained to her one evening as they sat by the Carson River watching the water flow past the place where she'd first saved his life. Justice punishes the guilty. Healing repairs what was broken. So what do we do now? We help with the healing. You with your medicine, me with mine. Silver Falls had changed in the aftermath of the trial. Some people like Morrison and Sarah treated Evelyn and Toe as heroes. Others, particularly those with business connections to Crawford's company, viewed them with suspicion or outright hostility. The town was healing too, but slowly and imperfectly. Martha Henley had left town shortly after the trial, unable to face the weight of her betrayal. Before she went, she came to Evelyn one last time. "I was wrong," she said simply. "I thought I was protecting my family, but I was just protecting my comfort. You showed me what real courage looks like." "Courage is just fear walking forward," Evelyn replied. "You'll find yours when you need it." Federal investigators continue to uncover the extent of territorial corruption, leading to the replacement of several key officials and the establishment of new oversight mechanisms. The Department of Justice created a special office to investigate crimes against Native American communities, though its effectiveness remained to be seen. Evelyn rebuilt her medical practice, but with a difference. Toa had taught her about traditional Shoshone healing methods, and she'd begun incorporating them into her treatment of patients. The combination of chemical knowledge and spiritual understanding proved remarkably effective, attracting patients from as far away as Carson City. More importantly, they'd begun training others. Young people from various tribes came to learn from Toa, while aspiring healers from white settlements sought out Evelyn's instruction. It was a small start toward the kind of cultural exchange that might prevent future tragedies. "You saved more than my life that night," Toa told her as winter approached again a year after their first meeting. "You saved the possibility of justice." "We saved each other," she replied, "and we're not done yet." But challenges remained. Some of Crawford's business associates had escaped prosecution and were reorganizing their operations in other territories. Threats against both Evelyn and Toe continued, requiring them to remain vigilant. Most troubling reports suggested that similar patterns of corruption and violence were emerging elsewhere in the West. One evening, as they worked together, grinding medicinal herbs in her rebuilt cabin, Sarah Morrison brought disturbing news. "There's been another incident," she reported, her face grim. "Up in Colorado Territory, a Ute village attacked dozens, killed survivors, claiming it was over mining rights." Evelyn and Toe exchanged glances. The pattern was depressingly familiar. "Federal marshals are investigating," Sarah continued, "but they're requesting expert witnesses, people who understand how these schemes operate." "You want us to testify again," Evelyn said. "I want you to consider it. What you did here saved lives and exposed corruption that might have spread unchecked. But I understand if you've had enough of being targets." That night, Evelyn couldn't sleep. She stood at her window, looking out at the river, thinking about cycles of violence and the long, hard work of building justice. Samuel had died believing he was powerless to change anything. She'd almost made the same mistake. The water keeps flowing. Toa said quietly, joining her at the window. Sometimes it cuts new channels, sometimes it returns to old ones, but it never stops moving. Are you saying we should go to Colorado? I'm saying the healing isn't finished, here or anywhere else. It might never be finished. Then we'd better get comfortable with the work. 3 days later, they loaded their supplies into a wagon and headed north toward Colorado territory. Behind them, Silver Falls continued its slow healing, a town learning to live with the truth about its past and the possibility of a more just future. The river flowed on, carving new paths, through ancient stone, carrying the stories of those who had passed before and those who were yet to come. In its constant motion lay a promise that change was possible, that healing could happen, and that courage, even when it came disguised as a desperate woman pulling a dying stranger from the ice, could reshape the world. Years later, when historians wrote about the territorial corruption scandals that reshaped the American West, they would note that the entire investigation began with a woman who couldn't bear to let someone drown. They would catalog the legal precedents, establish the lives, save the policies reformed. But they would miss the most important part of the story, that healing often begins with the simple act of pulling someone back from the edge, and that justice grows not from grand gestures, but from the daily choice to do what's right, even when the cost is everything you have left to lose. The river remembers what the books forget. It carries the voices of the saved, and the saviors the stories of those who chose courage over comfort, truth over safety. And in its endless song lies the promise that as long as water flows and hearts beat, there will always be someone willing to reach into the darkness and pull another soul toward the light. In Silver Falls, they still tell the story of the woman who saved a warrior from the ice and helped him save a people from extinction. Children play by the river where it happened, and sometimes when the wind is right and the water runs deep, they swear they can hear voices whispering words of hope to all who find themselves drowning in the darkness of an unjust world. The healing continues, one life at a time, one choice at a time, one act of courage at a time. The water keeps flowing, carrying their story into tomorrow.